clusters, if we consider the set of words displayed there, odd, cod, pod, squad, you can see increasing numbers of initial consonants, consonants at the beginning of that syllable, that word, as we go from 0 consonants at the beginning of odd, 1 consonant in cod, 2 consonants in quad, and 3 consonants in squad, represented formulaically by C with 0 to 3, then V for the vowel, and then C for the final consonant. So we can say that English has the possibility of up to 3 initial consonants in a syllable. You will probably know whether your own language allows just 1 or just 2 with sharp restrictions on them, 2 with not such sharp restrictions, or whether, like English, it allows 3, possibly even more. Then at the end of a syllable, again, we can look at the possibilities. Now, we saw in our previous lecture that the vowels fall into 2 groups, checked or free. I've chosen here a checked vowel, the vowel N in neck, which requires at least 1 following consonant. So there we have it in neck with 1 consonant. Well, we can have necks. That's a plural, but it could equally well be a word like fix or box, where it's all part of the stem. 2 consonants. Next, 3 consonants. And indeed, we can even have 4 in texts, which is a perfectly ordinary word, and yet contains 4 consonants. Here again, we do have to think about the morphology, the fact that texts is a plural of text. There aren't actually any simple words that end in 4 consonants, but if we didn't happen to have the word text, we might say there were no words that ended in 3. Text is based on exactly the same shape as past tense of fixed, fixed, which allows us to say things like text. And really, it's because of the English plural and past tense endings that we get these complications, but once we've got those possibilities, we can use them for ordinary lexical items as well, such as text. So, between 1 and 4 consonants at the end. Consonant plus R, as in pray. There on the screen we've also got bread and train, or a consonant plus a semivowel, yod or W. Queen there with qu. Pure, tune, twin, exemplifying some of the other possibilities. Or they're S plus something, as in spin, steam, skin, and so on. So there are those 5 basic templates, if you like, for 2 consonant clusters. But we can also have 3 consonant clusters, and they combine the 2 elements that we've already seen for 2 consonant clusters. That is to say, we have an initial S, then some consonant or other, and then a liquid or a semivowel, as in splash that we have there. That's possible because sp is possible in spin and pl is possible in pleasure. So putting the 2 together we get splash. Well, these consonant clusters do offer a problem to certain learners, as we've seen. If your language doesn't have the cluster that we need in English, there are basically 2 ways around the problem which learners will tend to take. One of them is to separate the 2 consonants and perhaps put something in between them, so that for bread we might get bread or bured or red, depending on your first language. So an extra vowel to make it possible. The other thing you can get is to insert an extra vowel before the cluster. So with splash, you might get a splash. again, making it pronounceable in your language by inserting something extra. S-lash or super-lash, whatever it might be, depending on the language. Well, both of those, of course, are techniques for producing something, but they don't sound correct in English. So those who tend to insert an extra vowel must work on removing it, so that we do indeed get pray and not puree, bread and not bread, train and not something else, splash and not splash and not splash. The other little problem with initial consonant clusters perhaps concerns the W element in queen and twin and so on. There's a Central European problem, Hungarians and various others, tending to make it a V with the labiodental base of articulation, thus queen, twin, rather than the bilabial, labial velar articulation that we use in English, queen, twin. Of course, this is, like other W sounds, similar to a kind of oo vowel, but shorter. So people who have this problem can practice saying queen and then speed it up, queen. Likewise, Japanese learners who have problems with rounding oo, queen, can again practice it by lengthening it, queen, and getting the back rounded quality there. One of the things in your pack that you were given at the beginning is this pale green booklet called Exercises on Phonetic Segments. And that, of course, has got all sorts of practice material for consonant clusters classified by the kind of problems that they offer. So the initial clusters are on page 3, sections B1 to B5. If you have a look there at B2, you will see why it's important not to have an intrusive vowel, an extra vowel, because in fact we do have minimal pairs of words in English, B2, such as parade, past tense of pray, versus parade, a parade of soldiers. One's pray, the other's parade, and the difference is the number of syllables. Plight means difficulty, polite means well behaved. Train on a railway, terrain, kind of ground. Soldiers have to cross difficult terrain. Cress, a vegetable. Caress, stroke. Clyde, proper name, place in Scotland. Collide, to come together. Nasal or a liquid, a lateral, followed by a voiceless consonant, as in the examples there, milk and lamp. Well, again, it's important not to intrude a vowel, not to say milk, but milk, all one syllable, milk. We did see the other day, when talking about Cockney and so on, that there is a new tendency to pronounce a kind of O vowel instead of L in this sort of word. So in my view, it's perfectly acceptable for you or your students to say milk, as millions of English people do, rather than milk. But what you shouldn't do is say milk, or something like that with extra vowels. Extra vowels. The other thing is that you must be careful not to forget the voiceless consonants. In other words, don't say mill instead of milk, don't say lamb instead of lamb, because it makes a difference to the meaning, it means something else. We can also have S or F plus a plosive, for example, as in the examples left, and beneath it, wasp. Again, both consonants should be present, at least if you say the word in isolation, left, wasp. we can have more than one wasp, which then gives us wasps. Wasps. Again, one syllable. In principle, you ought to be able to pronounce all of these consonants. In real life, you may observe native speakers doing a certain amount of reduction here, and instead of wasps, you will come across things like wasps, where the P is, well, not exactly missing, but not very forcefully present. Wasps, you know, some kind of lip gesture perhaps, but not much more than that. And one notices this with words like nest, plural, nests. Perhaps even more so, people say things like nests, where really the T can disappear between the two S's. But there are two S's, it's long. We know that nests is plural, whereas nest is singular. And another kind of cluster there, voiceless consonant plus S, fox. Of course, this is just the same as we have in the plurals of things like duck, ducks, back, backs, and so on. Although here it's in a word without a suffix, fox. Now we haven't got a separate section on the handout to deal with medial clusters. By medial I mean in the middle of a word. By definition, I think a consonant cluster can't be in the middle of a syllable, but it can be in the middle of a word. And there are plenty of English words that are like this, that have clusters in the middle, as whiskey, doctors, Scotland. Medial consonant clusters immediately raise the question of where does the syllable boundary lie? And different people have different views about this. For most people, it will be easy to put perhaps some of the consonants in the first syllable and others in the second. So whiskey, you can think of it as whis and ki, or if you find it easier, you can think of it as wit and ski. Either way, we've got to have the two consonants closely abutting one another and not whis and ki or something like that. Notice how equally in a word such as doctor, doctors, native speakers make those consonants very close to one another, doctors. We discussed this briefly the other day when we saw that there's an overlapping articulation here. Sometimes referred to as release masking. That term is on your handout somewhere at 3. Masking because the release, the k noise as the back of the tongue comes away from the velum, is masked, hidden, by the following consonant, the T, and that prevents you hearing any release. It's got no audible release, in fact, because that's masked by the following consonant. Well, again, looking at the booklet, final clusters are dealt with on pages 6 and 7, section D. Again, set out in the various different categories that we can recognize. And it's a matter of picking and choosing amongst those to see if there are any that are difficult for your language and for the people, therefore, that you might be needing to teach or that you might have difficulty with yourself. Some of them will be easy, some of them will be possibly difficult. The most complex consonant clusters we can see near the top of page 7, where we have these nice fractions, 5/6 and 11/12, where we get these complex clusters, 5/6. Well, I think everybody ought to be able to pronounce this if they need to. And the way to practice it is to take it slowly. So you say 6, 6, 6. And then when you can say it slowly, you speed it up. 6, 6, 6, 6, 6. Well, you need to be able to do it for demonstration purposes. I'm not convinced you need to do it for real life. What happens in real life? Well, you take 5/6 of them, 5/6 of them, 5/6 of them, Well, certainly the third goes, and we may well get some reduction of two S's to a single one. We don't necessarily have to have everything present in real life. However, be careful that you do have an S still here. Don't say 5/6 of them, because that's a bit odd. 6, 12, 11 twelfths. Again, practice it slowly. 12, 12. Vocalize this if you like. 12, 12, 12. When we speed up in real life, again, it's not necessary to have everything present. 11 twelfths, 12. I think I would probably keep the th and again lose the dental fricative 12ths. Winsor Lewis will be telling you more about elisions and things next week. We come to this question of medial consonant clusters. It covers various things that arise when syllables abut. But if you look at consonant # consonant, that's consonant word boundary consonant, there we've got the kind of thing that may need to be practiced. Keep calm. Nice time. What's interesting about keep calm? Well, keep calm is like doctors. In other words, the P at the end of keep may well have its release masked by the K of calm. So we say keep calm. Keep. You can't hear really. We don't say keep calm. We can do, but it's special careful pronunciation. Normally, keep calm. Keep calm. Keep cool. Keep calm. Calm. Have a nice time. Well, again, that's just a, some of you may need to practice not having a vowel after the S, not a nice time, but a nice time, nice time. Rich food, not richy food, rich food, but rich food, 2 syllables. Same day, still best. Both sides. Lots of cases where we have to have a difficult switch from one consonant to another. Perhaps we can make a good as in thick, we can make a good as in sick. Can we put them together and say both sides? Because we have to be able to. Both sides, both sides, both sides. And not both thighs, and not both sides, but both sides. So, again, a bit of sort of gymnastics may be necessary for a lot of these. Would you like it with salt? Move from one consonant to the other with salt. With salt. Then, as we know, speakers of certain languages have problems distinguishing v, labiodental, and b, bilabial. Vet, bet, vote, boat. Okay, we learn to do those. But then we've got to have these difficult cases where the two come together. And if somebody gives you a love bite, well, that's something that may be difficult to pronounce, though it may be nice to have. And love bite, we require the v and then the b, love bite. And it's not a love bite or a love bite, but a love bite. Those who have WV problems, Scandinavians, Germans, Hungarians, Poles, can practice saying, we've waited too long. We've waited. We've waited. Did he drive well? No, he drove badly. All the various things that you might require. At the bottom of the page, we have what we call homorganic fricatives. Now, this is where one word ends with a fricative and the next word begins with the same fricative. They're in a rough fight. Rough plus fight. What happens here is that we get a kind of long fricative. We just keep it going. We don't make it, break it, make it, break it. We don't say rough fight. We say rough fight, keeping the F articulation going twice as long. Rough fight, rough fight. Similarly, with a bus station, we have a long S. A bus station. A bus station. Not a bus station, but a bus station. Equally not a bus station, It's longer, a bus station. Nice size. The door needs to be pushed shut. I love visiting relatives. Love visiting. Long V. Breathe this, long the. And so on and so on. Homorganic plosives. Same thing applies really with plosives, except because they're not continuous in the way that fricatives are, the consequence is a bit different. You've got to come at the right time. Right time. Well, the point is we don't make it and break it. We don't say right time. Right time is very slow and very careful and not normal in connected speech. We say the right time. So here what you do is you make the T, right, and you hold it for a long time. And then you release it. Right time. So it's like right time, but you hold it for a longer time. Now, really with all plosives, we can think of the plosive as made up of 3 stages. As the organs of speech come together, as they stay together, and as they separate. So in the case of the T sound, the coming together is the movement of the tongue tip up to the alveolar ridge. Staying together is the compression of the air behind this. And coming apart is as the tongue tip comes away. We call these the approach phase, hold phase, and the release phase. So what we have in night time is an extra long hold. Just one approach, just one release, but a long hold. Night time. A bit tight, straight talk. Soup plate. We have a long bilabial soup plate. If you look at my lips, they come together once, soup plate, and separate once. Nobody would say soup plate, making 2 separate movements. Soup plate. However, Japanese beginners do say soup plate, or something like that. So it's worthwhile drawing to their attention that this is what happens in real life. Because of course Japanese has this kind of articulation anyhow. In kappa, it should offer no problem to the learner once they know they've got to do it. We have the corresponding thing with voice plosives. A bad day, or indeed a good day. That's a long hold D. These long holds are sometimes referred to as geminates, from the Latin for twin. Geminate consonants. We can also get the same effect where there's a change of voicing. So if we have D followed by T, did you have a good time? Good time. We don't make and break the articulation twice. We make the alveolar close with the D, a good. We keep the tongue there until we're ready to release it from the T. Meanwhile, we switch the voicing on and so on. So we don't say good time, we say good time. Did you have a good time? Good time, good time. That's a long alveolar articulation, extra long hold again. Only one approach, only one release. A good time. Well, for some learners all of this comes automatically and doesn't need to be thought about or pointed out. But for other learners it is something that needs to be taught and learnt. A big cake. A big cake. Big cake. Big. We make the velar closure, switch the voicing off, keep the hold, and finally release it voiceless with aspiration. Big cake. What we don't do is say big cake. We say big cake, a big cake, a big cake. So these are things about the hold. We can also have interesting things about the approach and the release. If we have a word like timber, let's just concentrate on the plosive here, how we make that. Timber. Timber. Now, we know to make a bilabial plosive we have to have the lips pressed firmly together. What is the approach phase in a word like timber? We can't say that it's the lips coming together, because actually, when we've got as far as tim, the lips are already together. So the approach for this B consists in the movement of the soft palate. Air is escaping through the nose in the case of the we have to cut off that escape by raising the soft palate, which turns M into B. Tim. You can't really feel that. You probably could if you curled your tongue tip back. You could feel the soft palate there in the air. And as you switch to thinking about B, it will flip up out of the way. Anyhow, the approach here, therefore, consists in this movement of the soft palate, and we call it nasal approach. The reason I'm starting with nasal approach is that everybody can do nasal approach. It's not a problem. However, when we then come to a word like submit, and we consider this B again, it's got an oral approach, a straightforward approach. Lips come together as we make O. So, but what about the release of that B? Submit. Submit. Notice we don't say submit. We don't separate the lips. We just turn the B into an M. Submit. How do we do that? Submit. By moving the soft palate. So this is nasal release. Submit. And that's something that some learners will have to practice. Whenever we have a plosive followed by a nasal, we'll probably get nasal release like this, submit. Now the sort of standard examples of nasal release are words like button, which I think is a very bad example to start with, because there are all sorts of special considerations there. I think you want to practice nasal release with voiced sounds, first of all. Words like sudden, therefore, or suddenly. Suddenly, nasal release in that D, we don't say suddenly, we say suddenly, 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 suddenly. And I would do it in this order. I would start with nasal approach, which is easy. I would then have the opposite sequence of events, nasal release in a word like submit. I do it with bilabials because everybody can see bilabials, rather than with alveolars that are not so easy to see. And only once we've got it with ordinary nasals would I turn to syllabic nasals. Syllabic nasals being, I think, more difficult. So we need to practice words like submit, midnight, badness, indeed goodness, which should be easier. And when we've got those, turn to syllabic ends, sudden, and last of all, turn to the voiceless ones, button. Why is that? Well, another reason is that in the case of the voiceless ones, it's acceptable to use a glottal stop instead, and to say button, 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 button. Now, that might or might not be easier for you. For some people, it probably will be easier, and if so, I see no reason at all why you shouldn't do it, because it is now the prevailing pronunciation, at least in Britain. But, on the other hand, it may be easier to do the old-fashioned kind of nasal release, button, where you hear the noise of nasal release, button, button. Both of those are preferable, in my view, to button. Button with a vowel between the T and the N is in danger of sounding childish, because it's what children say when they haven't learned to articulate it in the adult way. Though it's also becoming more widespread, maybe in another 100 years or even 50 years it'll be okay. Now, all of these things about nasal approach and release apply, making appropriate changes, with lateral approach and release. We've got words like building. Think about that D there. Assuming we don't vocalize building, but if we have a proper lateral there, building, we've got the tip of the tongue on the alveolar ridge, as we reach bill, how do we move on to this D? How do we make this D? We've got to move the sides of the tongue. Keeping the tongue tip in place, we've got to move the sides to cut off lateral escape of air, bill, and then we've got the complete closure required for the D. Then we release it in the normal way with the tongue tip, bill, D. So that's lateral approach. Now we can see what happens in a word like badly, where we have the opposite sequence of events. We have lateral release. We make the D in the ordinary way, tongue tip, tongue sides, sealing off the flow of air all the way around, bad. Then we keep the tongue tip in place, lowering the side rim or rims of the tongue so the air can stream out over the side badly, 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 badly. Notice again, we don't make two separate movements of the tongue tip. We don't say badly, badly. We say badly, clear, clear. Lateral release, badly, badly. Again, it's very easy for some learners to do this, but very difficult for other ones. But I think it's worth practicing it. Okay, once you've done it with words like badly, you can also do it with syllabic L, words like middle, and with a voiceless T instead of D. So Atlas, Scotland that we have there, Scotland, lateral release, and words like little. Now these difficult releases, nasal release and lateral release, unfortunately do occur in a number of very common words. Didn't, wouldn't, nasal release. Little, lateral release. So although they may seem difficult to learn, they are things that pay off. You can use them a great deal, and it'll make your English sound much better, of course, if you can do them properly. Let's look at the question of glottal replacement. We've already hinted at this. There are various environments where T is now commonly pronounced as a glottal rather than an alveolar plosive. If I use a word like department, department, there are two T's. Department. Perhaps you can hear that at this position I was saying not department, but department. I'm using a glottal stop there, and this is normal. Department. I'm using an alveolar T at the end. Department. Now, like other speakers, I do in fact have a range of options depending on the style that I'm using. It is perfectly possible to say department with an alveolar T nasally released. Department. That is now rather an old-fashioned and certainly a very careful pronunciation. Department. Younger people who would normally use a glottal stop here all the time, department, if they want to speak especially clearly, would probably release the alveolar stop separately and say department, as a kind of over-articulated, very careful pronunciation. Every day, though, department, and younger people might well have the glottal stop at the end as well and say department, department. On the handout, it tells you glottal replacement before possible word boundary and an obstruent. An obstruent means a plosive, fricative, or affricate. And so there are two typical examples. Nighttime, we had this for gemination, but instead of having a long alveolar, nighttime, perhaps more common is glottal plus alveolar, nighttime, nighttime, nighttime. Difficult to hear the difference anyhow. Football. And then before a nasal or liquid, instead of nasal release, atmosphere rather than atmosphere. Button rather than button. Brightly rather than brightly. Interestingly enough, this kind of glottal stop is used in American English as well. Americans very generally say brightly rather than brightly. And button rather than button.
Now, some speakers, some styles of speech, you get more widespread use of glottal stops. In word final position, I've given you there the phrase, it's not yet right. Now, in my lecturing style, you can hear all the T's exploded, it's not yet right. Not yet right. What will my 20-year-old students typically say? It's not yet right. It's not yet right. It's not yet right. Which I can sort of switch into as a casual style. I think the ones in the middle of the sentence are more likely to be glottal than the one at the end. So perhaps my typical casual style is, it's not yet right. It's not yet right. At the end of the sentence, glottal's earlier. But what this does demonstrate is that there's a very important equivalence in English between glottal and alveolar articulations. We feel they are different ways of doing the same thing, different ways of making the same sound. And this is, of course, good news, for example, for Cantonese learners of English. In Cantonese, lots of final glottal stops. They're acceptable in English for final T, word final T. What they're not acceptable for, though, is word final D. Now, a word like bad cannot have a glottal stop in English. We can't say bat instead of bad. So Cantonese kind of mispronunciation, bad time becoming bat time, bat time, that's not acceptable. You must make good final D. But it's perfectly okay to use a glottal stop for final T. It's interesting that when we look at the places where final T can be elided, which Mr. Winslow will talk about next week, they're precisely those positions where it couldn't be glottal, and vice versa. So in the word test, where there's a preceding obstruent, you never get a glottal stop. You never get test with a glottal stop. You get test. You get glottal stops only after a vowel, after a nasal, after a liquid, not after an obstruent. But it's after an obstruent that it might well be elidal if the next syllable begins with a consonant. So kind of complementary distribution. Yeah. Right, well, in section 7 I listed a whole number of particular difficulties characteristic of this or that language group. I'll leave you to work through that on your own if you wish, but I think at that point we finish today's lecture because it's time. Thank you very much.